Mode.
Hi, I'm Heather Staines, the head of partnerships for the Knowledge Futures Group, and I'm really excited to be here with you to bring you a discussion, bringing privacy and personalization into conversation rather than conflict. Next slide, please, Mary Beth. Our speakers today are Lisa Janicki-Henschliff, who's professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's also the author of Privacy in User Research, Can You? Our second speaker is Tim Lloyd. He's founder and CEO of LibLinks. He brings over 20 years experience in delivering pioneering educational products and services with a particular focus on identity and access in our industry over the past 5 years. So you can easily see why we've brought these speakers together today. Next slide, Mary Beth. We really wanted to bring you, as you could see in the title, a conversation between two folks. So this will be the last slide that we will share. But we did want to give you an idea of the kind of course of the conversation and how we anticipated it unfolding, some of the topics that we're going to touch upon, and hopefully ending with a little bit of an upbeat note on where do we go from here. So without further ado, we're going to go just to our speaker views, Mary Beth, and I'm going to kick off with the questions. So first, welcome Tim and Lisa. We're really excited that you could be here today. And could I ask you just at first to briefly introduce yourself beyond what I've said, let attendees know kind of how you got interested in privacy to begin with. Maybe we can start with Lisa.
Absolutely, and Heather, Tim, both great to see both of you here today. And to work with you on this project. So as a librarian, the value of privacy and information seeking is part of the way that professional formation happens for a librarian. And I went to library school at age 22. So it was also sort of formative, I think, of just the way that in general I see the world. But I'll also say that I was a philosophy major in college, and so there's some background there that's really about thinking through what does it mean to be able to inquire freely into a topic and what are the conditions that enable that. And obviously education, so that you have access to information, that you have ways of thinking about it. But the other thing is that our work is continuously. So it has a genesis in my educational background. But the other thing that I tend to be very focused on in my thinking, especially I think this comes from the philosophy degree, is the notion of agency and people's ability to have agency over their own lives and to set their own course and their own path. So for me, it's this combination of agency as well as sort of intellectual inquiry that is the backdrop for my interest in privacy. So fast forward a few years to the position I was able to work with Andrew Asher at the University of Indiana, Bloomington, where he and I both had some interest in what was happening with library analytics and the ways that library analytics were starting to come on the scene and needed some scrutiny from the perspective of our professional values of inquiry and privacy. That work that I did with Andrew was really raising awareness among librarians even about what was happening with learning analytics, because not all librarians were aware of the ways that technology was operating within our libraries and on our campuses in particular as an academic librarian to result in collection of user data. So I was fortunate to be invited to serve on the NISO Privacy Principles Working Group, as well as to participate in a number of IMLS-funded convenings, one that Bonnie Tinjera and Michael Zimmer hosted at Data and Society in New York City, and then another one that the team at Montana State University put together, so I was actually able to be for that project. Out of that project, I now also have a Mellon grant to work with libraries on how we want to use our licensing practices in order to further reinforce the values of user control and privacy over their own data and information seeking. So it feels like this is well, it is a 2-decade journey here, but particularly the last 5 to 7 years have really brought this into focus. I was fortunate to be invited as well to serve on the RA21 Privacy and Security Working Group. I continue to serve on the Seamless Access Advisory Group, the Get FTR Advisory Group. So one of the things that I've really appreciated has been the opportunity to at least engage with our library business community, the publishing community and the like around these issues. It's not always been a place where we fully agree, but I appreciate that there's been these conversations.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Tim, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and your interest.
Sure. So I spent most of my career working in publishing. Spent about a decade at a humanities publisher called Alexander Street Press, which is now part of Progress. I left that business to start LivLinks in 2014, and I've been working in identity and access for online resources ever since. A key reason I started LivLinks was the challenges I faced as a publisher in trying to understand user needs, delivering a more relevant, engaging experience. In my case, I was developing and launching scholarly music databases, streaming audio, video, images, where it was essential to, as a product manager, to understand, was the user interested in world music or classical, which have very different discovery experiences, whether they were faculty or undergraduates, researchers, very different content needs. And yet, the IP-based authentication systems we relied upon, effectively left us blind in trying to deliver a more effective experience. We didn't have good systems for offering alternative authentication methods or for enabling user registration in a way that allowed us to build profiles and deliver a better experience. And so one of the drivers behind LivLinks was my desire to give libraries and publishers better tools to understand user needs and offer more personalization. As soon as I got into this, I realized that one of the distinguishing features of our industry is this gatekeeping role that organizations play in preserving user privacy. And it didn't take long to realize there are these large gaps in expectations between both publishers and libraries and within the publishing and library communities. And so, as I realized that it was a lot more complex than I'd appreciated at first, and I wanted to get more involved, I got involved with the RA21 work and part of one of the technical pilots on the outreach group, which gave me a chance to engage with the library community, and that's how I met Lisa.
Great. And I want to just ask you a little bit more about how the two of you really got going in an exchange, because we did, title the session and organize it around a conversation. So maybe, given the work that both of you have done with RA21, you can just let us know, a little bit about how the conversation has evolved with the two of you.
Yeah. So I think we could mention that I was part of RA21, the Privacy and Security Working Group. And as that RA21 initiative sort of wound down and its successor organization initiative, Seamless Access, was sort of reborn. The reality is, I think we know because it played out somewhat in public on the Scholarly Kitchen blog, there was some tension during the RA21 process, where in particular around the issue of user privacy and user control over their own data, and who would be sort of, if you will, the agency or the fiduciary group that sort of held that data for the user, and where would that data be controlled. So I think it's fair to say that there was tension, maybe even a little conflict at times, but I do think also people were really think through. And so, as speak for Tim for a second here, but as Tim was preparing a Seamless Access presentation, actually for the Charleston conference, he recognized that he wanted to make sure he was making sense to the library audience and connecting to that audience. And knowing, I think, me having been there outspoken, he reached out to me and asked if I'd give him some feedback, and I was quite willing to do that. And I we had I think almost an hour-long conversation, maybe longer, about why did I make the suggestions that I made, and really trying to articulate why privacy is so core for librarians, and ways to frame this conversation that wasn't about a fight over privacy.
Hey, Tim, I know we want to hear from you, your side of how the conversation started, but on the off chance that there are a few folks here, since we jumped right into talking about RA21, a few folks maybe aren't aware of the initiative. Could you just, before you talk about the conversation with Lisa starting,
Sure.
just give us like a quick overview on, RA21, if that's even possible?
Yep, no, I've done that quite a few times, so that's easy. So RA21 stands for Resource Access in the 21st Century. That was the original name of the project. And it started out of a conversation between publishers and actually corporate librarians who were interested in making greater use of federated authentication and migrating away from IP authentication, and just finding it was complex. There weren't good systems, wasn't an obvious route for them to do this. And it grew into a project which then became, what's holding back better methods of accessing resources. And so the project started in 2016 or 2017, I think it was late 2016, ran until June last year, 2019, and it came out with a series of recommendations. And the work was firstly investigating, what methods of resource access were then, and what was the best one for the 21st century, what fit best. And the conclusion of the project was federated authentication. And then looking at, what if we wanted to make federated authentication more seamless, and what was involved, what was the friction that was stopping people using it, with a particular focus on the users. The project was primarily led from the publishing industry. They got other groups involved. There were working groups like the one that Lisa got involved in, but it changed in the makeup of the project when it ended and then became seamless access. And seamless access is a collaboration across industry groups. The founders include organizations like NISO, Internet2, Géant, which is a European federation, ORCID. And seamless access took those recommendations, but really wanted to say, okay, we've got this set of recommendations. What's the way that we can work as a community across all the different stakeholders to deliver a more privacy-preserving as well as effective method of accessing resources? So the focus definitely changed. And to take it into my conversations with Lisa, I, despite having spent many years presenting at library conferences and working closely with librarians and electronic products, I'd never had a conversation with a librarian about privacy. Now, in large part, that was because we were using IP authentication. We had no information that could track a user in any case. But it meant that I felt actually poorly prepared for that. And that was one of the reasons I reached out to Lisa in the first place, because I could see from conversations like the Scholarly Kitchen that there was not a meeting of minds there. As a community, we weren't aligned. We didn't really understand each other. And I learned a huge amount from those conversations, and really appreciate Lisa's input and others as it helped me. And I was very grateful that my role in outreach gave me a chance to shape the message, because I felt that if we didn't change the message and make it clearer and make sure it was other stakeholder groups like librarians felt heard and understood, the project was not going to succeed. So that was a key part of it, getting that shared understanding.
Great. And for the publishers and vendors who are on the call, Tim, maybe we can talk a little bit more about stakeholder perspectives. You talked about the evolution of some of the access mechanisms and some of the reasons why publishers were, less involved in conversations with other stakeholders. What are the complexities on the publisher and vendor side that you've seen, and how has that changed over time?
Right. I think the publishing industry overall is just very late to the table when it comes to understanding issues around identity and privacy. As an industry, we've the dominance of anonymous IP address authentication has occurred over many decades, and it's meant that the privacy tools built into publishing platforms can vary from none to minimal. If your only method of authenticating users is anonymous IP authentication, then you don't really have much of an identity strategy, and you collect minimal personally identifiable information. And that's without getting into the debate about where IP addresses start to become personal data. So for many publishing platforms, access controls are rudimentary, and in turn, many publishers have largely treated access control as a minor function that becomes part of a platform and not something to pay attention to. While federated authentication methods like shibboleth and open ATOMs can share personally identifiable information, if configured appropriately, or in some circumstances inappropriately, by and large, most publishers don't rely on it. It's inconsistent. There's no standards around what should be shared. You can't really build a system around the expectation you're going to get something. So, systems either have to become very complex, and this covers the vendor world as well as publishers, to cope with all the different varieties of information you might or might not get, or you just sort of push them to the side. It's not unusual for me to have to let down publishers who hope that federated authentication will work like Google Identity on their phones and provide a gateway to mass personalization. It really doesn't work like that. There are publishers who put dedicated effort into encouraging users to independently register credentials with them, separately from the institutional authentication method. But actually, I hear pretty mixed results on this. Many publishers feel it's a waste of time because either few people sign up or few repeatedly log in with those credentials, or their platforms unable to leverage the profiles built to actually deliver a more interesting experience. And you get this sort of vicious circle where people are offered the chance to register, they find there's no benefit to them. Actually, there might be a disbenefit. They may get marketing they weren't interested in, and so people give up. So we really just haven't, as an industry, thought through, what does an identity strategy mean? How does it manifest itself in our user experience, the benefits for users, how our products work, how the technologies underpin them? It's complex. One interesting sign of change was the STM Association's annual Tech Trends Forecast, which was published as an infographic earlier this week. So that was the third week of June. So this is an annual forecast that's done. It forecasts for several years ahead in terms of what the tech trends are for the industry. This year's forecast had a particular focus on the user, and it listed 7 key trends expressed as user wants. What does the user want out of a publishing experience? 4 of those 7 tie directly into identity and privacy. So one was make things easy for me. And the verbiage used in the infographic mentions seamless access, a personal profile, the idea that users have different roles. So recognize the role I'm in when you're interfacing with me. Another one was let me do it my way. So that's about personalizing the experience for me and what I want as a user, not someone else. Having customized learning tools. A third one was show me I can trust you. Well, that ties directly into issues of privacy, integrity, data security. And the fourth one was give me control over my data. So this, I think, is the library community and thinkers within it starting to recognize that going forward, these are major areas, and yet I don't think they're well prepared for it as an industry.
Great, and just one follow-up there, Tim. I guess Seamless Access did a survey recently of the academic community.
Yes.
So as part of our work on the outreach committee, we wanted to understand, what were the barriers within institutions to making greater use of federated authentication, and we had a sense that the problem didn't necessarily just lie with challenges that the library faced. Maybe there are other departments within the institution, and in particular, we wanted to understand how libraries and IT departments work together. So the survey was sent to academic, library, and IT staff. We received just under 300 responses. There were 2 surveys because we had different questions depending on whether you were in the library or IT. And the results for us were very indicative of poor levels of communication. And so the way we saw that was responses that indicated that there were things that the IT department knew that the library was unaware of, or there were issues where the library really wasn't consulted at all sometimes. There was relatively low levels of communication. And, just in the same way that publishers, as a product manager, when you want to do something, if you're not aligned with the IT department that delivers it, it's pretty difficult to make it happen. The same is true, obviously, within institutions. And I think there's a lot we can do as a community. And I think there's something we can do with seamless access as well to improve the communication there and improve the standards and tools and just understanding of how this technology can support privacy.
Great. Lisa, you want to pick up from there? You've mentioned a couple of occasions how it's sort of an integral part of almost your DNA, that privacy as a librarian, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think this, even what Tim just mentioned with the seamless access survey, is a really great start for what I think we're going to really need to understand, which is eventually I think we're going to need some work that's a little bit almost more ethnographic, where you've got a campus as the unit of analysis, and you've got the librarians and IT. So we can start to see, what does it look like when this relationship is working well? Because we need that paired response, right? So not just technically well, where the data is passing, but also collaboratively well, communicatively well, right? Because we all have cases in our lives where things actually work, but it's so painful to make them work. So what does it look like when you have this fully functional partnership? What does it look like when you can get things done, but it's not fun? And then what does it look like when that's a dysfunctional relationship, and what are the implications of each? So these are the things I start to think about. And I think this is one of those things too that, when we go back to RA21 and they started with the corporate environment, that's just such a different environment than the higher education institution environment, which is not to say that what they found for corporate isn't right for corporate. It's that what's right for corporate is not a good match to the higher education setting. So I think it's great that seamless access is really sort of seeking to understand that context a lot better. This also, though, relates to the fact that libraries and IT professionals don't share this DNA piece that I mentioned. And so there's a lot of tension sometimes between what IT would like from a data management and security perspective, and libraries wanting to also preserve that intellectual freedom and independent agency of campus faculty, students, et cetera, and their ability to inquire without danger of scrutiny. So these are things, all of these things are good, right? No one thinks that network security is a bad thing to have. It's just we're always making choices about, the way where these two things come into conflict, or at least press against each other. Where is that balance going to be? And so there's a great opportunity for education as well, just for libraries to understand more around the IT technology, for IT and other folks to understand more about the service model that libraries are pursuing. I'll admit that librarians in my experience are pretty skeptical of the claim that users want a personalized experience. Now, maybe as Tim said, it's just because they've never had a good one. But we do even have platforms that a user must create an account on in order to use them. And users do not report finding great value from that in most cases. So I think they can imagine the idea that there could be this value, but they're not experiencing it delivered, which I think then is part of what we'll probably end up talking about later, which is part of user control over privacy is it worth it? When I tell you something about myself, what do I get in return? Not to make this only a transactional question, but as users make decisions over their own data, that's the part of the question they're asking. Is this extractive of me, where it takes data from me, but it doesn't deliver any value back? So I'm glad to hear Tim, leading on this idea of an identity strategy, so that the whole goal then is to deliver user value through that data capture and the like. We do, however, know that users are very interested in being the center of their own workflow. And in fact, in another Scholarly Kitchen article that I wrote about the discovery world, one of the principles we've come to understand at my library from doing surveys and interviews and focus groups is, when users say they want everything, what they mean is my everything, right? So, if they're a chemist, they mean all the things interesting to me as a chemist. They don't really mean I hope that some random extra things from the music field that happens to use the same terminology shows up in my search. So the users are very user self-centric in how they want the world to be arranged around them. And an identity strategy could help with this. But it's typically not that they want to be the center of their workflow on every single publisher platform. They want to be the center of their own workflow. So if platforms can begin to feed in that in a user-controlled, privacy-protecting way, I think there's great opportunity there to deliver that value. Some of the pseudonymous IDs that we're starting to hear really thought about seriously. I was in a webinar yesterday learning about how ebooks are starting to improve privacy protection for library users. And a lot of it has to do with who is holding which data points. So the vendor is holding certain data points, the library is holding certain data points, and who has the ability to match those up, and where then is the value delivered. So I think libraries are increasing their attention to how user data is captured. We're particularly concerned when there is no option for opt-in or opt-out. That sort of, you can't get access to the information without revealing a bunch of things about yourself is a scenario that we don't find particularly tolerable. So I'm looking forward to seeing the user data practices, policies come into better alignment with our library service models, and then the promises that we make to our user communities. I mean, if you go to any library website, you will see that we are telling our users that we are trying to create an environment in which they can inquire freely. And so that's just a high priority, and it's also part of the promise that we make to our user communities is to protect their information seeking.
Yes. Now, a lot of people, joining this call from the publisher and vendor side may have taken up an intense interest, maybe beyond against their will, with the whole implementation of GDPR and other privacy protections around personally identifiable information, or PII. I think when, from the publisher and vendor side, which is the side that I personally know about the most, creating personalization gives insight into what users are doing and who those users are, and that promise of insight can be put forward to the library as, wouldn't you like to learn more about what your users are doing? But yet that data is being collected, it's being evaluated. Tim, maybe you could start. How did GDPR kind of kick our thoughts around this into higher gear, and what sort of data collection and evaluation is possible within this new constrained process?
So one of the interesting things about GDPR is that it's remarkably readable. Unless you have to read it, you're going to shy away from it. But I would encourage people to Google GDPR, the regulations online. It's very easy to understand English. And the top sections introduce some very basic principles that I think we can all relate to and will be very familiar to librarians in the audience. They apply to any organization that wants to collect personally identifiable information, whether you're a publisher or a librarian. And it's just worth restating those. They're very easy to understand, but if you are working at a publisher and you're looking to deliver a more personalized experience, these are core principles you need to understand and bake into your processes. So the principle that the processing has to be lawful, fair, and transparent. And lawful really means that you either need explicit consent, or that processing is necessary for performance of an existing contract or compliance with a legal obligation. In most scenarios for publishing, it's explicit consent that you need to get to do this. The second one is purpose limitation. You should be only processing it for the purpose that is actually needed to support the user, not other purposes that you just think might be useful. Data minimization. You should only be collecting the data needed for that purpose, not what their favorite cat is and where they live, if that's not necessary. Accuracy. Make sure the data is updated and kept accurate. Storage limitation. Don't store this stuff for 10 years if the user stopped using your service 7 years ago. integrity and confidentiality, which is pretty obvious. And then lastly, accountability, and this is an important one. And a lot of the scary things about the regulation are that you will be held accountable for misuse of that data. So I think it's very important that people appreciate all of these concepts, and it's not just give me a username and email and let me make magic for you. But the messy reality is that systems and workflows just are not in place to support this in the publishing industry. So for example, under federated authentication, the user data that institutions release is called attributes. And the technology supports the concept that profiles can be applied to a category of services, such as library vendors, to simplify what attributes should or shouldn't be released. But there are no standards in place for what those categories look like and how and when user data should be shared. And so it's a bit of a wild west. Similarly, any release of personally identifiable information should be underpinned by a legal agreement. Again, this is explicit consent that follows those principles. There aren't good templates for this. There isn't a good shared understanding across the industry of what's appropriate and when. Now, both of these examples are things that we're addressing in seamless access with cross-industry working groups. But there are other ones that still need to be addressed. Another really good example is actually collecting user consent. So again, federated authentication has the interfaces where you put in your credentials as a user, but no systematic way for that user to be informed about the personally identifiable information that's been shared or to provide consent about that. So, publisher A might not need an email address, publisher B might. What's the way that that consent is collected? There's a very interesting Internet 2 initiative aimed at building scalable solutions for consent that have been developing an extension to Shibboleth, which is one of the commonly used open source software solutions for federated authentication. And that will give institutions a framework to manage this. People who are interested should Google consent-informed attribute release. But where we stand right now, there isn't a systematic way to do this. So there are lots of shortcomings within systems and processes that make it hard to just go ahead and implement this. It really requires a lot of thought.
Great. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, GDPR, the California legislation, these are all absolutely good things. But I also sort of want to say that legal frameworks only get us so far. So Tim has just sort of unpacked the degree to which, GDPR is there, right? But we have a whole industry that's sort of struggling, if you will, to get itself up to working with it. But what I would point out is that there's a question here then, what do you do at the moment when you are not able to comply with these things? And one of the things that the library community would sort of, I think, challenge is what I see has happened in a number of cases. I won't say every case, and I won't do any specific call outs, but I could, but I won't, is that in spite of not having these protections in place, in spite of not complying, publishers have moved forward with data collection. They have implemented systems where they are receiving data attributes. In many cases, the user is actually being told that their data is being passed at the demand of that publisher. So there's communications questions there too. And I mean, Ralph Youngin for example, has been very public in a number of talks he's given about seamless access and Get FTR, that indeed his platform was receiving attributes, and not only was it receiving it, it was actually using it to create a personalized message to the user. So it would say at the top, "Welcome, Lisa." So my university was sending attributes, telling me it needed to send them. ACS was receiving them and wasn't sort of getting rid of them, and then it was actually utilizing them. Now, to give Ralph credit, and this is why I'm willing to say it, first of all, he's saying it publicly, but secondly, they've corrected it. So that's good, but I think what this also points out is that we should have trust within here, but we also need to have the audits and the accountability. So we hope that these systems are working well, but I recall a period about 2 years ago where I was raising this issue of my campus saying X publisher demands these attributes, so we're sending them. So I was at least being informed as a user. And all the publishers going, "We're not demanding those, we're not demanding those." And I was like, well, you're getting them, so what are you doing with them? And a number of publishers sort of behind the scenes came to me and said, oh, we didn't actually want those data points. Because of course, once you receive them, you actually have risk and obligation with them. And so the good news with that sort of moment of like, oh my gosh, was that publishers are now taking action in many cases to sort of be like, do not send us that, because we do not want these attributes from end users. So as I said, there's been some real tense moments in this process, but I think we're moving in the right direction, including I think there's now more awareness that we shouldn't just implement things and then see how they're broken. We should actually look through and implement them in the ways that we want to do that. So that's a huge step forward. And so I really want to, as much as I'm willing to call out things that are problematic, I think it's equally important to say these are the right actions to be taking. So the right action to be taking is to improve attribute release so that it matches what a publisher actually needs in order to deliver the service, to improve communication to the user about what is being released and their agency in that. So in my institution, one of my frustrations was always the option was either let the data be passed or don't log into the database that I'm trying to get my PDF from the article I want to read. So GDPR also has this notion, right, that I should have some control and understand what it's going to be used for. Is it going to be saved? So there's a lot of opportunity here, I think, to improve this. I just go back to the fact that libraries really do believe fundamentally that intellectual freedom requires this kind of control and this privacy over the information that you're accessing. So it's not just privacy that's at risk from our perspective, it's actually the freedom to inquire, which of course we would connect to democracy, citizenship, self-agency. So there's a really strong values framework here and ethics framework, which is why we put so much energy into this. And I think, publishers have come to appreciate this, I think, through Tim's work in particular, where he's been an ambassador for helping to understand how deeply, where this sits. It's not sort of a random thing we thought on Tuesday. But then the second piece of it is I think they're beginning to realize that their own business interests, not just because of what libraries may or may not do in contracting, but just because of some larger things, that their business interests are aligned with wanting to be more user privacy protecting and give users more control over the user experience on their platform. So I think we're moving in a really good direction in general, and there's a real opportunity to right some of these historic wrongs that have sort of crept into the system, probably inadvertently in many cases.
Great. We've kind of strayed a little bit into our next question where I wanted to ask you a little bit more, it's not just the technology, it's the policy side. Lisa, you got into that a little bit. Maybe Tim could talk a little bit about the challenges of balancing what might be done with maybe what could or what should be done. And then Lisa, you can follow up.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's ugly. When you look at the systems that are in place to try and support this. So, one of the ironies of this conversation is that a lot of the authentication technologies we're talking about, especially ones that underpin a privacy-preserving access experience, are pretty mature. There's no new innovations required specifically on the access technology. It's just systems and workflows, but technology delivers a lot of that. So, just as a quick rundown of some examples, you need systems for managing privacy from a user perspective. As Lisa was talking about, they need agency here. So you need to collect consent. You enable them to review and manage the data being held about them. There's no good systems for doing that that are being used in the publishing industry. It's all bespoke. You need systems for integrating authentication across legacy platforms that are architected in different ways and rely on different technologies. Imagine as a publisher with a variety of products and a variety of different markets and a variety of different technologies, you're getting in these feeds that just look very different to each other, different levels of data, and you have to try and integrate this into a consistent pipeline that you can then treat. That is really challenging. You need systems to manage the user data collected, including personal identifiable information. And these systems have to meet the requirements of data processing laws, so security, accuracy, transparency, accountability. And then even when you've done all that, you need systems that can leverage that to deliver the benefits that users are looking for. And, you know, as much as transaction sounds like a grubby phrase, I like to think of it as a transaction. I think there should be something transactional about this, that if I'm giving you my data, what I'm getting back has to match the value you're getting. And, you know, unless your publishing platform can do that, you're sort of stuck. You can put all the data protection in the world in, but at the end of the day, users aren't going to get anything that's going to give them the benefits of doing this. And then the last point I'd make is that, you know, these systems typically cut across departments within an organization, whether that organization is an institution or a publisher. And so obviously they need to be underpinned by policies and processes that in turn depend on staff operating them to have the skills and experience needed. You know, I don't know how many IT staff are as hot on data privacy as they are on data security, but I bet there's a difference there. You know, we hear a lot about how data science is a hot new area. I suspect skills in data privacy and security are going to be a lucrative area in our industry over the next 5 years. They need to be, because there's, you know, a whole upscaling in people's knowledge and awareness that needs to happen to be effective here.
Yeah, Lisa?
Yeah, I feel like we're sort of combining. I know we're going to also talk about education, which Tim just sort of got into, because these things are all so related, right? So not only is it complex, but it's also this like internet tight web of some of these issues. So, you know, I think there's a lot of other questions too that we're sort of trying to understand too, right? Like, so even once these systems are in place and there's personalization and their privacy, then there's the question of what's the role of the library as the contracting party, right?
Yep,
So
it's a great one.
that's, I think, another complexity that we haven't, I think it's lurking in the background, but we really have to bring it out here, which is this is different significantly from consumer privacy. Because in consumer privacy, it's the individual and the company providing the service. But with academic services, you've got the company providing the service, you've got the individual utilizing the service, but in the middle, you have the contracting party, which is the library, campus IT, it might be the bookstore, because we could talk about course materials, and what the role is of who's paying the bills on behalf of users being able to get access, and sort of what sort of controls should come into play there is another one of the issues, which I think is also why we see the vendor community sometimes a bit confused, because they hear one set of expectations from the library if they work with librarians on a particular campus. But let's say on another campus that is an area of activity that is managed by IT, then they are going to hear sort of front and center a different set of values, a different set of priorities, I guess I would say. And on some campuses, if we're talking about course materials, the primary contact is going to be the campus bookstore, the Center for Teaching and Learning. And so, you know, if different groups are sort of in that contractual role, you're going to also be bringing different things. So one of the things on the university side is I think we're also working internally, just like publishers are working internally, platforms are working internally, to really come to a more cohesive framework internally about what should the privacy experience be of a student, not just on library resources, but also in the course management system, also when they're using an online textbook, so that there's sort of a coherence that starts to gel across this. And so I know many campuses have really ramped up to sort of a university senate or the like, look at some of these privacy issues that historically may have been dealt with more at the independently in the units. Now, it'll still, of course, be dealt with independently on a frontline way, but we've got these bigger principles that we really need to work out. And learning analytics is a great example of an area that's really brought that to the fore, right? Because tracking students as they go through their coursework is potentially even more fraught than tracking what they're reading, which is fraught in its own way, of course. So there's a lot going on there. So, you know, maybe I'll launch into sort of like, so also the other piece is, especially in higher education institutions, our responsibility to our students. You know, they are adults in most cases, and yet they're also come to us with an expectation that we will be a part of their education and their formation. And so there's also an obligation here to educate people, not just about what platforms do, but also why they might want to think about their user data in certain ways. And so we see some really great projects coming out with data privacy, literacy kinds of trainings, particularly aimed at students, but also technology literacy at privacy for even the advanced user, right? I suspect we're all on a laptop right now using a browser or using GoToMeeting. You know, we've probably clicked through a bunch of agreements. Maybe Tim knows how all his data is being tracked, but I'll admit that I don't.
I know how it should be, not how it is.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of room, I think, for education here. And I think that's one of the questions that's being asked of the platforms. You know, what are you doing to make sure that it's informed consent, not just consent?
Yeah, maybe Tim, can you talk a little bit about what the publishers are doing, or at least how they're talking about what needs to be done before we move to our final question area?
I think there's no consistency here, and I think just as to think of institutions as one thing or libraries as one thing is wrong, to think of publishers as one thing is inaccurate, because publishers vary hugely in their flavor. And, within publishers, these departments are moving at different speeds. So, I encounter a lot of publishers where maybe someone in IT is starting to pay attention to this, but no one on the product side is. Or someone in customer service is saying, hey, I keep getting these questions from users about what we're doing with the data. Does anyone know? But no one's answering them. Or there's some consultants advising about the CRM system saying, have you guys thought about the personal data? And everyone's looking blankly around the room. And it's such a fairly complex thing, and the system requires the interoperation of many pieces. But very few organizations outside the major publishers have the sort of skill sets and resourcing to move in one direction. And I think what we're seeing happening in the rest of the publishing industry is that individuals are starting to pay attention, and depending on where they sit in the organization, they might have more or less impact. And some smaller publishers are just feeling, my God, what do I do here? Maybe I should just cling to IP authentication because, getting into anything else just seems scary right now. So I think it's all over the show. One thing's definitely true, though, that publishers who start to deal with lawyers who ask them to include data publishing agreements, that's when, the foot hits the pedal. That's when people start getting really clear about the risks that they face, and organizations that start understanding how the legal ramifications play through, they start doing things much more quickly.
Great. One last question. When we were getting together to plan for this session, you guys mentioned you'd seen a little bit of a change in the societal perspective in recent years around user expectations, which is something that's kind of been a thread throughout this conversation. Maybe just in closing, you could talk a little bit about that. And Tim, could I ask you to start?
Yep. So I definitely sense a shift in the vendor and publishing community over what's acceptable. So, when I was a kid, you smoked in restaurants and no one thought about it. You littered and no one really paid attention to it. And now it's viewed as socially unacceptable. I think playing fast and loose with personally identifiable information is becoming socially unacceptable. And so regardless of whether publishers are paying attention or not, they are aware of the opinion of their clients. And as the community as a whole starts to recognize this is something you need to pay attention to, otherwise, you're not working with integrity with us. That, I think, is going to start causing a more general shift in society as well that will play into the publishing industry. So I think attitudes are absolutely changing here. But the understanding to inform it isn't yet. The attitude will come first.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And I couldn't agree more. This is such an evolving area. I think that we've really seen like general societal questioning, right? In the consumer area, right? Facebook, credit card processing, and the like. But we're definitely seeing this enter the publishing arena as well. And I think that's a huge step forward. I think in the end, we might see that privacy and user control over their own data attribute release has the potential to be a competitive advantage in the coming years.
I agree.
Not just from the perspective of what libraries will be looking for, though I can tell you that we are increasing our attention to this, and particularly the public libraries. We've been mostly talking academic here, but I can tell you the public librarians are are really working hard on this because they have not had the benefit of IP authentication to rely on for remote access, and they are very concerned about what is happening with reading histories, especially in the ebooks area, with the tracking that is clearly been, and then the data breaches that have happened. The data breaches have primarily for libraries have come to the public librarians. And so that's another question, right? It's not just, it's also what happens when data gets breached. And so there's a huge opportunity for publishers, platforms to put themselves out as a competitive advantage as privacy is baked into their systems. And then if I can just say, even more so, the competitive advantage will go to those who can also prove it, who have some sort of audits or some sort of review process. Because that's the other thing that has happened now, right? Facebook and a number of other companies have been found to be not exactly doing what they told their users they were doing. And so, you know, it'd be nice to be an environment where we could just trust, but I think that trust has really been broken. So there's a lot of work to be done here. But as I think Tim and I sort of are both individually, but sort of representing the groups that we're part of, there's also an opportunity, but there's a lot of effort here right now. And so I'm glad for this opportunity. Heather, thank you for inviting us to speak to this topic, to get more people aware of and involved in this from both the library and the publisher, the society side. This is an all hands on deck issue, and I think we're getting there.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you both for your contributions, and thanks to SSP for giving us the opportunity to share this conversation. And we look forward in the future, you know, to taking up more detailed, in-depth considerations of some of the things that have been raised today. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you.